everyone. Let me tell you the story about my thesis. It all started when I was going for an internship in Chennai Metro, where it was delayed, and I was inspired by this problem of construction delays. And I started looking at projects around the world which was having a lot of delays. So I went and researched on it during my master's and mapped the problems. And I was particularly drawn by this philosophy of project management 2.0, enabling agile project management practices. So during my master's, what I did was took a component of automated data collection to enable construction monitoring by looking at the structural responses from the construction equipments to update models. But what happened was the models weren't detailed enough to do that. So during my PhD, what I was trying to do was to integrate automated data collection with other processes to create an expert system to enable agile project management practice. So during the early days, I tried to implement prototypes to enable bidirectional information flow between construction site and offices to actually do this thing. But every time I was hit by this problem of data silos and construction process information, which is fragmented across multiple databases in both digital and non-digital formats. So to understand that in detail, I went into the construction site. I examined 3 projects, 2 in London and 1 in India. And I was always hit by this problem again that the 4D BIM doesn't have enough detailed information. It has lack of detail and semantics in the construction process information and lack of constraint codification. Looking at the reasons, it was because mostly it was manual process, it required cross-domain knowledge, and complex and interdisciplinary constraints needs to be modeled. So my research question for my PhD was how to embed this complex and dynamic constraints into a building information model, or in other words, how to codify detailed construction information into a model so that we could do future automation and enable agile project management practices. So during my PhD, I tried different techniques, and finally, I came out to, I started using link data for linking the data sets across different domains. And so it has the capability to link across domain and also provide logical inferences. So I use that particular feature of link data to model the constraints. So I model complex and dynamic constraints using shapes constraint language. So it's quite a coding kind of things like a SQL query, but a SparkQL query. So what I did was I created a small interface similar to 4D just for demonstration for industry. And that was my idea with the PhD on codifying this constrained information. Having done that, now what I'm looking at is you have the codified information. How can you actually enable this project management 2.0 philosophy of agile project management? So anytime there's a change in the site, the schedule needs to update because you have that detailed schedule with you now. So I'm looking at reinforcement learning and genetic algorithms to generate look-ahead schedules at small windows based on the input from the sensors or maybe updation from the site, prior planned, also the model constraints. So that's my PhD in 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Thank you.
Thanks, Ranjith.
Yeah.
Great. Here's some quick assertions. I'll say things, you tell me what you think about them. I'll make some assertions, you tell me what you think about them.
Okay.
The Chennai Metro is going over budget, not so much because the monitoring and control is wrong, but because the initial estimate was wrong and because production management is wrong.
Yes and no, because yes, because there's a lot of issues on what do you say, coordination between different facilities, etc., underground utilities, etc., which contributes to the major delays. And no, because when I was there at the construction site, I could see the mismanagement in the data because they were not actually looking at different subcontractors' data or the models, etc., which was creating conflicts. And we are having small delays, 2-day delays, 1-week delays, etc., which cumulatively goes into a larger delay and tampers with the prior plan of it. So yes and no. So initial estimation, yes, I would agree with that.
Okay, second assertion. If you imagine that you use your genetic algorithm or some other optimization tool to update the schedules on the basis of what you've collected from sensors and your constraints, which is great work, by the way. If you do that, you risk losing the human element of collaboration that is required to create new workable schedules that people can work with, because the constraints are not only what you see on the site.
Yes, I've received this problem from the industry itself. When I was I was in the look-ahead planning meeting during my studies and during the testing phase. So what happens is like they could put in to the model, but they need that human interaction, and maybe sometimes they pick up something more from like the kind of like a plan while you are doing the look-ahead planning, etc., rather than from the model. But that happens for everything, and I'm hoping that's an institutionalized practice within the people to understand this from it. But then my PhD focus is how can we embed into the model so that at some point when you are actually doing the model-based collaboration, as we say it, this could help.
I have a couple of questions on methodology.
Okay.
And because you're focused on codification.
Yes.
So how do you validate whether you have the necessary and sufficient number of codes in there?
Yeah, so this is this is one major problem that I'm looking at right now. So what I'm doing now is like enriching this model along with the look-ahead planning team and generating the schedules and like comparing it with them. So initially there wasn't enough information, so my schedule was always optimistic rather than theirs. So when you add more and more constraint, it is getting updated. But then what I'm looking at is certain constraints which are like main stuff between interdisciplinary, because it might be between the crane operator and the module that is coming and supply chain. So major constraints, if they are modeled, the look-ahead plan is coming as proper. But if you're going too detailed into it, it might not be required. But the other problem on the other side of it, ADC is like looking at like very simple process. So I was looking at like how to create that control point on it, and I was drawn by the work presented earlier by Shabazi, who were looking at determining the control points for basically looking at where the production, based on the production control. So when the productivity is changing differently, that is where basically the events are. So the constraint should be something related to that.
A related question, which
Yeah.
is, I think it's the same question phrased differently, is if someone else was doing the codification, would they come up with the same codes? So how do you validate the objectivity of the codification?
I didn't understand your question. Can you repeat it?
So typically when you develop coding schemes or anything, you typically have more than one person doing it.
Yes.
So that it's not a subjective decision of the individual doing it.
Yeah, so here what I'm trying to do using that prototype is reduce that things, because the query is generated by the program. So you are actually adding constraints based on some snippets, initial snippets of the query, and then query gets enriched based on the input from the user. So in that way, we are creating a standardized way, but I agree there would be differences, so I will have to like think about something in my thesis, either as a limitation or to enable it.
Ranjith, you mentioned data integration.
Yes.
What kind of data are you talking about, and how do you achieve it? Is it through a database, for instance? Is it through a common repository, file exchange, IFCs?
So
what exactly are you?
Currently what I was the data I was looking at was, one was the crane specification, the module specification from the modules that are coming. So this was initially in PDF formats, so crane specification, etc. So I tried to convert it to XML and then use that to generate an RDF out of it. So right now it is everything in RDF format. So in my prototype, it generates, so the process data, for instance, is collected either from an IFC file, so IFC task data, or from the JSON interface of Synchro. So that is the process data that's coming in. And the other data is like currently created as XMLs that is coming in. So ideally, in an ideal world, all this data would be hosted on the cloud following linked data principles. So you could actually query it and get the data.
I also have a number of questions, but it's for the coffee break, I think. Okay, the sixth presenter will be Jens.